right practice, skillful practice. It's called the middle way, right? So it's not something that's fully 100% active, and it's something that's not fully 100% passive. It's neither the energy of a bulldozer or fully the energy of a doormat, of course. It's the middle way, something else entirely. And I like to describe it as something that is actively passive and passively active. So, what does being actively passive mean? To me, it's that really wonderful, magical, blissful stepping back into the witness observer view. No matter what's happening in the conventional world, in conventional reality, just that ability, that space to watch it happen. It's like this, as Ajahn Sumedho would say, or whatever combination of words really does the trick for you, whether it's welcome to whatever is happening, or yes, thank you to whatever's happening, whatever magic spell it takes for you to cast on your own mind to step into that witness observer view, go ahead and cast it. But it's that space between what is happening in conventional reality and then when we just take a small step back, a small step up, and just observe what's happening in our bodies, in our minds, all around us. To me, that is being actively passive. And it does take a little bit of effort, right? Because we're all born into this human existence because we have a certain amount of craving. So we are raised and conditioned to just go along with the churning of samsara. So it does take that active effort to take that step back and not get swept up with the churning waves of samsara. And Ajahn Sumedho sometimes starts his talks by saying, I don't know why I give these anymore. I always say the same thing. And sometimes I hear people also saying like, oh, he always says the same thing. And I think the question is, are we listening closely? Are we applying it to the depths to which it can be applied? Because there's like beginner level of applying that teaching, and then there's all the way up to very advanced. So I think the beginner level of applying that teaching of just stepping into that actively passive view and actively passive perspective and way of being. Beginner level, which is much easier to do, is if the conditions around us are very spiritually pleasant. So there's many kinds of pleasure, right? There's the pleasure of cookies and ice cream, and then there's the pleasures I'm referring to now, which is like being at a really beautiful retreat center surrounded by ferns and tall trees at one center, or maybe rolling hills of grass at another center. Knowing exactly where your next meal is coming from, what time it will be, having someone cook it for you, having all just oceans of time to meditate every day. This is very spiritually pleasant. Having trusted teachers give Dhamma talks every day, maybe twice a day, being surrounded by people who have taken the precepts, feeling very safe, taken care of, very spiritually pleasant surroundings. So, can you apply it in those surroundings? Can you step back from conventional reality and just watch and witness feelings arise, feelings sustain, and feelings cease? And thoughts arise, sustain, and cease. And if you can do that, then great. Level 1 accomplished. Let's move on to level 2. What would level 2 be? Probably when things are neutral, or maybe something that is mildly unpleasant, like a slight paper cut or like a very slightly annoying remark from someone, having to wait longer than you would like in the grocery store to check out. So, mildly unpleasant. Can you also apply it then? This is level two. When you're stuck at the checkout line, can you just watch your breath in and out, watching that impatience or frustration arise, sustain, and then cease? And then, if that mildly unpleasant circumstance becomes easy, in which to step back into the observer view, then congratulations, you have passed level two. Let's go on to level three. Level three would be, I think, something mildly pleasant. You know, this can be really fun to try, by the way. Like next time you're eating something very delicious, instead of fixating on the delicious thing that you're eating, it can be fun just to step back and observe the sensation of that conventional pleasure, worldly pleasure, arise in the body, sustain for a while, and then cease. So the experience of eating that delicious food, there is something independent of that in the body, that pleasure arising, sustaining, and ceasing. And then if mild worldly pleasure, it becomes easy for you to step back and observe, then congratulations, you have passed this level on to level four. And I would say that would be something extremely worldly pleasure, extremely pleasant in a worldly way. And my favorite example of this is when Kyle proposed to me. I was so over the top happy, ecstatic in a worldly way. I felt like one of those carnival games where someone swings down a hammer and hits a lever and it causes a puck to catapult up the wall and hit a bell at the top, except instead of hitting a bell, it smashed the bell into 100 pieces and flew off into the heavens. And that's how happy I was. I remember in the moment that they went down on one knee, that their face was in clear focus for me and my vision, but the whole world around their face turned fuzzy and soft. And I was so happy in that moment. And then in the very next moment, this voice in my head went, oh no, now that moment has passed. And then there was a lot of clinging. So these over the top happy moments in conventional reality can also be a source of clinging, suffering, attachment. So then this level would be even in extremely pleasant moments, moments of such joy and loving kindness, of just such happiness. Can you also take that step back and just witness and observe what it's like? And in my experience of this, that joy and that love, that celebration, all of that goodness is still there. But by being fully in the present moment and watching it and observing it, that bliss just washes over me without the clinging, without that second moment of, oh my gosh, now the moment has passed. I'm never going to be that happy ever again. And there are many moments of so much happiness in life. And for me to think right after getting proposed to that I'll never be that happy again, it was just delusion. And when we step into that witness position, we can experience life with just as much joy, but also wisdom. And we'll know that happiness will continue to arise. When we lead a life of goodness, it that happiness and joy multiplies. We just don't cling on to it. And that is a much nicer kind of happiness, I think. All right, so if a practitioner then masters level 4, extreme pleasure situation, then congratulations. The fifth and final step, I think, would be situations that are highly, highly, highly unpleasant. And then can you also apply that teaching of it's like this to those circumstances? There was a time a few years ago when, for a long time, Ajahn Sumedho's talks didn't make sense to me. But then there was a time when his talks finally started to make sense, and not just in an intellectual way, because, like, intellectually, if you read the transcript, it's pretty easy to make sense of it intellectually. But finally, I was really starting to understand with my bones, understand with my kidneys. So I was starting to listen to a lot of his talks and really soaking it in. And then there was a time when I got into an argument with Kyle, and then just because I had been soaking it in so much, then I was able to really practice stepping into the observer view, even when I was at my most triggered. And I remember just watching what was happening, watching this sense of terror arise, and realizing that I didn't have to believe it. And I remember I was lying down at the time when we were having this conversation. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have to be devastated. And I turned to Kyle in the middle of that difficult conversation, and I told them, I'm realizing right now I don't have to be devastated. And it was such a lightning clap, epiphanic moment for me. And after processing it a little bit more, I was realizing that I had all this conditioning from early childhood, with a lot of explosive rage in the household. Uh, One of the very few ways that I could receive mercy from that rage was by expressing devastation. So my brain had learned this conditioning that when I felt like I was in trouble or when there was a really difficult conversation happening, especially in an intimate relationship, to be devastated. And then in that moment of practice, I realized that I don't actually have to repeat that pattern. So we can just watch what's happening in our minds. And when we see what's happening, we can also teach our minds how to be more skillful. And I just feel so grateful for those teachings from Ajahn Sumedho, and of course passed down from every teacher before him. And to anyone who thinks, like, why should I keep listening to him? He just says the same thing every talk. I would really invite you to investigate how courageously are you applying those teachings? Not just at level 1, not just at level 2, but all the way to those extremely difficult, triggering situations. Isn't that a fun challenge? I mean, come on. And I would really urge people also, when you see something that your mind is doing that is not very skillful, to teach your mind what to do instead that will lead you to a more and more pleasant abiding. And pleasant here, with that word, I'm referring to the spiritually pleasant, spiritual pleasure kind of life. There's a sutta where, in the Samyutta Nikaya, I believe, where Sariputta teaches us through the sutta, teaches us that even those who have completed the path, even arahants, need to contemplate the five aggregates with anicca, anatta, and dukkha. And why do they need to do that? Why do they need to keep practicing? Is so they can have a pleasant abiding. And I think that kind of pleasure looks like a life of contentment, pretty quiet, very peaceful, with varying degrees of metta. Um, So by that I mean, like, sometimes arahants agree to step forward and teach, and I imagine there's a lot of joy and metta and compassion in that practice. And sometimes they choose to retreat and just live a much, much, much more quieter life that is more centered around peace. So whether they decide to center their life more around loving kindness or more around peace, there's just a lot of spiritual pleasure there. And this is something I would encourage all practitioners to cultivate our lives toward. Because I think sometimes when people really resonate with the teaching of just observing, being in the witness view, which is a wonderful teaching to resonate with and a wonderful teaching to practice, and I highly, highly, highly encourage everyone to practice this, then I think sometimes I've noticed then people decide that no matter what conditions, not just to practice observing it, but then to not change it and not try to change it. But even in the suttas, the Buddha really encourages people to take action. There's a sutta where, if I remember the title correctly, is Jungle Thickets, where the Buddha teaches people that if whether they whether to stay or go from where they are abiding. So if someone reflects on how their practice is going at a certain place, and if their practice is deepening there, then to stay there, even if it's very uncomfortable. Versus if someone reflects on how their practice is going and it's not progressing, then to leave, even if it is very comfortable. I think there's an underlying assumption in the teachings of the Buddha that people are going to take care of themselves. And this is something we can see too when he says, like, all people, like, life is dear to all people. I don't remember exactly the words, but life is dear to all people, and like nobody wants to die. But in the time in which we live, in the culture in which we live, in the Western world, there are a lot of people for whom life is not dear, and a lot of people who wish not to live. So the culture is a little different. But yeah, there's all these signs in other places of the teachings, right? Like the Buddha said no eating after midday, but then a lot of people with health issues would go up to the Buddha and say, "Excuse me, I think I do need to eat something after midday," and he would allow it. And there's just this sense of people taking care of themselves that I wanted to bring into the conversation. So if, when observing your own mind, observing your own environment, you can discern a way to take care of your own mind or to cultivate an environment where you feel more supported in practice, then I think the official advice would be to do it. in a way that promotes skillful, right practice, harmony between people, more and more sila, dana, samadhi, all that good stuff. I think that would be right practice and skillful practice. And the best way, I think, to discern what conditions will be helpful or not is to view our own minds, bodies, environments from that witnessing perspective. And I see this so often at work, for example, like when we suddenly get an urgent project with, it seems like 100 steps and a tight deadline. And maybe a lot of people would be prone to panic. Then we can step into the witness position and teach ourselves we can only do our best. We can only do one thing at a time. And rather than panicking about all 100 steps, let me just do one thing at a time and get as far as I can. And that is all I can do. This reminds me of the instruction to practice like your hair is on fire. And I think sometimes that phrase can conjure up like a cartoon image basically of someone whose hair is in cartoon flames and they're just running around in circles screaming with wild eyes. But I don't think that's it. I think I've never had my hair on fire, but I've been in other emergency situations, and I'm actually reading a book right now about how people respond in disaster situations. And people respond in many different ways that I'm reading in this book. It's called The Unthinkable, if anybody were curious. Uh, but some people in emergency situations will just their nervous system will short circuit basically, and they'll just crumple to the floor and not move. So that's like the freeze response. Some people will just be wallowing in denial instead of taking action. Some people will leap too quickly into action. Uh, but there's this particular emergency response that some people engage with. And this is not really a choice, it's like your nervous system is wired a certain way. We've evolved in a certain way. But some people will just become actually very, very calm. And there's only one thing in their mind, and that's what do I do next? What do I do now? So, one example I read in the book was someone who, as a child, fell from the rooftop. It was a dangerously high height, so like maybe 15, 20 feet. And he described as he was tumbling off the roof, it was like he could see his thoughts progressing past his mind. And first, the thought was, grab for the edge of the roof, grab for the edge of the roof. And then as he tumbled further or farther, he realized the roof edge is too far now. I cannot grab for the roof edge anymore. And then as he tumbled off the roof, he then turned and saw the ground, and his mind said, okay, the ground is approaching, the ground is approaching. And I think that is more of the mindset that the Buddha proposes with practicing like our hair is on fire. That actually extreme calm and focus and the mentality that only one thing matters. For that kid falling off the roof, the one thing that mattered was be safe, prevent harm. Which, is kind of similar to the one thing that matters for a dedicated practitioner, right? Be safe. That's Nibbana. That is very, very safe. Pure consciousness cannot be harmed because there's nothing to be harmed. And when someone has crossed the finish line, then they are always attuned to that pure consciousness. So the one thing that matters when we practice like our hair is on fire is awakening. That is the one focus, and nothing else matters. And when I say that, I'm not suggesting that everyone just lock themselves into a closet and meditate for years and years without coming out. Maybe for someone out there, that is the best way for them to awaken. But I imagine for a lot of people, when you only focus on awakening, maybe that would bring you even more into community, into a space where people are also practicing, where you feel a lot of inspiration and sincere dedication from the people around you. I think it looks different for everyone, the external form of what good practice looks like, but that sincerity and that dedication is what matters. I think when we practice from that witnessing perspective and we're in any kind of relationship, and I do mean any kind of relationship, like a partner, a friend, the person who's checking you out at the grocery store, someone that you are driving next to at the intersection. When we operate from that witnessing perspective, then our relationships also become so much warmer and sweeter and more functional, healthier, more peaceful. And I think a great example for me of this would be in the times in my life when I was most wrecked with grief. The people who really loved me and were close to me, I noticed this tendency that they wanted to just like parachute in and fix the problem. But when that happened, and when they were telling me what to do with my grief, because they seemed so scared of my grief, so scared of just doing or saying the wrong thing sometimes, by parachuting in and inserting themselves in what they thought I should do, it really made things a lot worse. It made my grief so much more painful because not only then was I dealing with the grief, but I was also having to navigate this betrayal of the people who I was in the closest relationships with. Versus when I was navigating some really difficult feelings, there are times when people enter into an interaction with me and it I can feel so tangibly that they're not there to fix me. They're just there to be with me and help doula that painful feeling. And that is when they have completely changed my life by being there. They've saved my life, really. Just by being with, responding to what I needed in that moment. That is what has saved my life. So I'm saying that when people were operating from just wanting to fix, from a sense of self, it really hurt. When people came in just witnessing and observing, that was when goodness just flowed. And then, of course, we can apply this tool or this practice of stepping back and observing. We can apply it to what we need in our practice. We can observe, what are the conditions and under which my practice is the richest, when progress is the most exciting and maybe takes on a new speed or a new depth. Not that speed is the thing that matters, and let's go quickly. Life is short, even the full human lifespan of 120 years compared to all the time that we've already been born and born and born again since the undiscoverable beginning. 120 years is very short. So let's make full use of it. So, who are the people when we listen to them, we can feel metta just blossoming all by itself? Who are the people when we listen to them, we feel the clang of wisdom reverberating through our whole system? What kind of environment is supportive? Ajahn Suchard talks a lot about when he was shopping around for a monastery to stay with. He definitely was looking out for one where there was not so much ceremony. It was just a lot of dedicated time for people to meditate and be by themselves and be in solitude and seclusion. Versus Ajahn Ganha talks all the time about how work and community are so important. So I would highly encourage people to just refer back to their memory files of what are the conditions under which practice is the most inspired and the most motivated, is the deepest, the most sincere, the most dedicated. And put in the causes and conditions for that kind of supportive environment to arise more and more often in life. And then also let's get to know our own minds, right? What does our own mind need to have a pleasant abiding? To have a life that is centered around peace and loving kindness, where the mind feels safe and at ease. If we cultivate these environments and cultivate our mind more and more so it's like an arahant, then at some point we will become arahants. I think, when I first started in this lifetime becoming more involved with sutta studies and Dhamma groups, at first I thought like, oh, maybe it seemed like Nibbana was this faraway thing, and arahants did not feel like they were tangible people. The Buddha seemed more like a mythical figure than a person who lived at some point in India. But it's actually so close to each of us. The Dhamma is right here and now. There is that part of our mind that is already enlightened. And there are people among us who have finished the path. And it's not this thing that, as I understand it, not this thing that necessarily takes hundreds of lifetimes to attain. Not really even something to be attained at all. But when I know someone who is practicing very well, then, and if I haven't spoken to them for a few months and we speak again, then there's a part of my mind that wonders, maybe they're at their next stage of awakening. And sometimes there's no way to know for sure, but sometimes it seems like that is the case when we speak again. Or maybe even if you haven't seen someone for a few weeks or a few days, maybe they have advanced to their next stage of awakening. It's this very present, dynamic practice that we're all engaging with. And so also for each one of you who are listening, maybe in a few years, maybe you will be fully awakened. Maybe in a few months, who knows? Maybe in a few weeks, you'll be at the next stage of awakening. Maybe in a few days, hours, minutes, I don't know. it's this alive and dynamic thing that we're each engaging with this process. We're so lucky. We're so lucky to have such wise teachers like the ones I've named. Ajahn Sumedho, Ajahn Suchard, the Buddha. We're all so lucky. And of course, when we are operating from that witnessing position of knowing anicca, anatta, and dukkha, it can also make us so much safer in times of great adversity. And there's this other thing I want to share with you from that book I'm reading, The Unthinkable, about people responding in disaster situations. Uh, the author mentions that there are three factors that determine how resilient someone is in times of great adversity. So how well they cope during that time of adversity, and also how they recover after adversity. And the three factors are corresponding perfectly with the three marks of existence. So the first one is when somebody is confident in their ability to influence life events, which to me rings of anicca. They know that whatever awful thing is happening right now, it's impermanent, and they have confidence in their own agency to influence and impact the environment and their own life. The second one is when someone is just feels this conviction that they can always learn from these life events, whether it's happy or unhappy. And to me, that is a way of speaking about understanding dukkha. And then the third one is the person's ability to find a meaningful purpose in life. And to me, that is a way of speaking about anatta. And when I think of the highly adverse events that I've been in life, in the times when I was able to navigate and not be so burned through the process, the meaningful purpose was love. Navigating a really difficult school to work in and learning to speak up to the authority there at a time when I was very afraid of authority. I did it because I loved my students. And having to navigate some really difficult work situations later, the whole be like dirt situation or other really hard bosses, I did it because I loved my partner and we needed to make ends meet, and I didn't want to stick all the financial burden on them. I wanted to show up as a good partner, and out of that love, I stuck through that situation and really, really progressed in practice by being there in that situation. And then I think there came a point when I became so confident in practice that through love for practice itself, I was able to navigate a lot of situations because I knew, anyone who loves the Four Noble Truths, we know that on the other side of suffering, there is relief, there's bliss, there's letting go, there's deeper wisdom, deeper compassion, more and more ability to love unconditionally, and out of love for practice. Or maybe another way to say that is out of love for myself, in a way that is not about the sense of self, but out of this knowing that there would be a higher happiness on the other side of that suffering, and that I was worthy of that happiness, and that we are each worthy of that happiness. It was that love that pulled me through a lot of difficult situations too. So I wish you all a lot of rich practice with being actively passive and passively active, attuning more and more with that witness observing position in our minds and taking, what's a better way to say it? Navigating all of life's circumstances from that witnessing position. And that would be very, very, very rich practice indeed.